All right, ladies, today's chapter is Chapter 7, which refers to climate and biodiversity. The main concepts for today are, firstly, differences in climate, based mostly on long-term differences in average temperature and precipitation, largely determine the types and locations of the Earth's deserts, grasslands, and forests. Secondly, the Earth's terrestrial systems provide an important ecological and economic service. Thirdly, human activities are degrading and disrupting many of the ecological and economic services provided by the Earth's terrestrial ecosystems. Yes, yet again, we are screwing up the Earth. So, firstly, let's talk about the factors that influence climate. These can be divided up as the sun, the Earth's rotation, air currents, water currents, and terrain. We kind of group them up into three main factors. All right, so the sun gets its very own of the three factors because the heating of the Earth is uneven. There's a greater focus of the Earth's energy on the equator. The sun's rays are able to strike the equator directly, focusing all of their energy on a very small amount of space. As you move towards the poles, the angle of the rays increases, dispersing the energy over a larger area, so that you get less or the same amount of energy spread over a larger area means that the generalized heating is much less than at the equator, where it's a very focused heating. This increase in energy in the tropics causes a greater rate of evaporation, which in turn causes a greater rate of precipitation. That's why rainforests are considered rainforests. It's always raining every day. Our second major factor is the Earth's rotation. As the Earth rotates, the equator spins faster than at the poles. Speed is distance over time. The equator has a larger distance to go around the Earth than the very narrow top of the poles. This spinning faster pushes air up and to the east or west, creating cells of directional winds. These are called Hadley cells if you really want to go and look up the specifics of how they work. This pushing of the air creates prevailing winds, winds that are always blowing, and these distribute heat and moisture over the Earth's surface. As you see, between the latitudes of the equator, which is called the doldrums, 30 degrees north or south and 60 degrees north or south, the winds alternate direction. This is because of the rotation of the Earth and the difference between the northern and southern hemispheres. The third main factor is where we lump everything else, the properties of air, water, and land. First, we're going to talk about the air. The air and the water influence each other. So specifically, the prevailing winds, they pull at the surface of the water with the Coriolis effect, creating water currents. This upper image is very much like the one in your book, and it shows that at the surface of the water, you have these warmer air currents, and they move throughout the oceans that cover the Earth, and eventually, as the water loses its energy and becomes more dense, it drops down and becomes colder and drops into the colder currents, the downwelling areas. The bottom image is more of a 3D effect of this. If you look carefully, you can see that all of the different continents are being represented, and it really shows how the heat and the density of the water matter. You can read more about this in Chapter 7, Section 1 on page 150 if you want to get really in depth with the how it works, but I'm not going to spend time here during the lecture going over it. So just like the water influences the air, or air influences the water influences the air. The evaporation of the ocean water creates these convection cells that circulate heat and air and moisture both vertically, so up and down, and from place to place across locations around the Earth. This is a picture taken from your book. It's figure 7.4. It is also on page 150, and it just talks about how you start out with hot, wet air as it evaporates. Once it gets up into the higher pressure areas, it cools, condenses, the water precipitates out, and then the water moves from a high pressure area to the lower, cooler, drier air pressure, where it then falls because hot air rises, cool air comes in to take its place. As it cools, it falls and is compressed. It warms up but is dry. It moves towards the lower pressure area that has all of that nice wet air and is warmed by the sun, and then the whole system starts over again. Again, if you want to get more in depth with this, that page 150, I'm not going to spend more time on it in lecture. Now, when we're talking about climate, we also need to talk about greenhouse gases and how humans are impacting it. As you know, we are having a huge increase in the human input to greenhouse gases through the burning of fossil fuels, clearing forests, growing crops, etc. And right now, the trend is that we're having a larger and larger impact on the Earth's climate. Carbon dioxide is being added to the atmosphere faster than the carbon cycle can remove it. Remember, plants are the big way that carbon dioxide is being removed from the atmosphere, and that'll come into play later on when we talk about biomes. If current models are projecting properly, which there's always a little bit of error or a lot of error, because these are models, they're projecting out into the future, and we always know the future is uncertain. However, if these models are projecting properly, this increase could lead to altering precipitation patterns, raised average sea levels, and a shift in areas where crops can grow and where certain organisms can live. We see this especially with the organisms being able to live in the areas where they are right now, in the idea of the poor polar bears not being able to live because all of their ice is melting. If you want an example of this for crops, right now they are having issues in California growing wine. There are certain varieties of wines that their grapes have to be grown in a very small strip of land where the environment, the climate is perfect for them. That area has been shrinking and moving closer and closer and closer to the Pacific Ocean every year. Eventually, those wines aren't going to be able to be grown because we're going to run out of land between where they're growing and the Pacific Ocean. Just two examples to make this a little bit more real when you're thinking about it. All right, so we're going to sneak in, even though this isn't a major factor, it's pretty important, the fact that surface features affect local climate. So, you guys should have learned back in the day about the rain shadow effect creating deserts. Water evaporates from the oceans. It is that warm, moist air rises up the mountain where the water vapor cools and condenses to form clouds. The precipitation falls on the windward side of the mountains, and all the water is gone, so that when it moves onto the other side of the mountain, the air is dry with no water vapor. So that dry air means that the other side of the mountain has a desert because it does not have enough water. That's all I'm going to say on that. One of the other things that we have created that affect local climate are cities. Cities are considered heat sinks because they're all of the buildings, the concrete, the asphalt are really good at absorbing and holding heat. We also have increased pollution in these areas. All the cars, all the people create more carbon dioxide, all those kinds of things. And all of our buildings block wind. This results in a higher temperature, more smog and haze, and lower wind speeds than the surrounding areas. If you want a visual of this, here's a picture of Boston. If you look at the inner city of Boston, it's red. This is the temperature of the surface temperature of Boston and the surrounding areas. You see the city itself is bright red, gradually going into these yellow pockets, and then the surrounding area is blue, various colors of blue, and the ocean is blue. If you have areas where there's more vegetation, the temperature is going to go down. Areas that are mostly composed of concrete, asphalt, building materials like that absorb and hold that heat for a longer period of time. This is why people often say that DC is a couple degrees warmer than Silver Spring or even Frederick, because you don't have as much of that urban heat island or heat sink effect going on. So let's get into actual biomes. Big idea, climate molds biomes. Each biome has a certain type of climate based on its latitude, elevation, and surface features. All of these things combine to determine the dominant plant life in a biome, because plants that are able to survive in that elevation, type of climate, things like that, are going to be the ones that survive there the best. Now, people say, oh, the Midwest is a grassland, but biomes aren't actually uniform. They're patchy, which is caused because the distribution of resources across the earth is not regular, it's irregular and random, and because human activities can impact these things, and we'll get more into that later. So, climate variation is mostly based upon average annual precipitation, which is a fancy way to say rainfall, and temperature. Biomes are divided into tropical, temperate, and cold/northern as one set of descriptors, and then forest, grassland, or desert as the other. I'm not going to go into all of the different types of biome, chaparrals, tundra, all that kind of thing. That is something you need to do on your own, and that is actually your assignment for this week. I'm going to keep moving on. So, plants and animals adapt and diversify in order to survive in their biomes, and biomes have varying amounts of biodiversity and impact on the global climate. So, talking about biomes as natural capital, because we love to talk about natural capital, and how we, as humans, keep screwing things up. So, deserts do form their own purposes, but we're going to focus on human impacts for these. Deserts are incredibly vulnerable to SUVs and development. The soils there are very, very thin, sometimes only a millimeter or two thick, and take decades or centuries to recover. Centuries if you have desert cities. Temperate grasslands are what we have converted into farmland. They are so good at producing crops that we use that thick topsoil and we use it to feed ourselves. Unfortunately, in converting this to farmland, we've removed the drought-tolerant grasses from the ecosystems and their roots that help maintain the topsoil. So if you do any research into this, you'll learn that there's a lot of concern, especially in the Midwest of the US, that we're losing that super thick topsoil and it's going to make the land less productive. Tundras. They have a fragile soil system like deserts. So when we have things like drilling in Alaska or pipelines from Canada down into the US, mines and military bases, disturbing these areas, these biomes, and these ecosystems, it can take them centuries to recover. All right, so this is going to wrap up part 1. We're going to do another few slides for part 2, and I'll get into what your assignment is there.